And guys, that'll bring us to our final segment of the show. I know that this has been a relatively light podcast episode, but don't worry, guys. This next segment will probably take up, I don't know, a good chunk of time because I have a lot to talk about here. So for those of you who have been, keeping up with the new TV shows that have been coming out, there has been a little show from a kind of, niche, small franchise. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's called Lord of the Rings. And a new season of, or I should say, the first few episodes of a new season of The Rings of Power have dropped on Amazon Prime Video. The Rings of Power, and this kind of shocked me as I was preparing for this episode. I was taking notes. This kind of shocked me here. But if anyone... if any of you have been around the channel long enough to remember, I actually did a review of the first 3 episodes of the first season, or maybe first 2 episodes of the first season of The Rings of Power. That's how long this channel has been around. And I don't mean that to say, it's been like 2.5 years, I think, since the last season of Rings of Power, which is, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. So yeah. This channel has been around long enough to have talked about the first season of Rings of Power, and now we're here talking about the second season of Rings of Power. And just to give a little bit of a background before we jump into it, and this is going to be a full spoiler discussion because, for a couple of reasons. These episodes were super long. And that's a good thing, by the way. Just I said super long almost as if I was, criticizing that. No, I think that's a fine thing in general. I think you'd prefer to have longer episodes of most shows. Obviously, if they're bad, you don't want longer episodes. But, in general, we'd prefer to have longer episodes of TV shows, especially the good ones. So these are long episodes. They released 3 at once. And so I was definitely not able to finish all of them when they first came out. Not even the second day they came out. I, just before recording this episode, actually have finished watching the 3rd episode. And so the thoughts are fresh in my mind. And I was unfortunately not able to get any early access to the episodes or anything like that. So yeah, just saw the first 3 episodes. And so because of that, and also because I just want to talk in greater detail about what I saw and what I observed and what I'm hoping to see in future episodes, this is going to be a full spoiler discussion. And the way that I'm going to do it is going to be pretty similar to how I've been doing these rewatch podcast episodes, or at least the DCEU ones, excuse me. If you watched the previous one I did on Man of Steel, it was almost a play-by-play of the film, which I thought was kind of fun because it allowed me to go through my notes again and really go through all the major points of the film. This is obviously not going to be that long, even though these 3 hours were basically the length of a longer feature-length film. I didn't take that many notes. I just took notes on certain things that I was noticing, little thematic elements, character moments, and things of that nature. And so we're going to kind of be going through each episode, one episode at a time, and then I'll talk about sort of the overall holistic thoughts at the end as we do that. But yes, this will be a spoiler discussion of the first 3 episodes of The Rings of Power. Before we get into that, though, speaking of season 2, I just want to give some quick context on season 1 and how I thought about it, so you guys know, so you guys understand where my thoughts are coming from. I think it's always important, because I think we all think about and have different opinions and differing thoughts on these episodes of TV and these films, and because of that, I think it's actually even more important that I tell you where I'm coming from, what my experience was with the first season of Rings of Power, and even more so with The Lord of the Rings, because just like just about everyone, I am a huge fan. I've actually just started rereading The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, just for fun, and it's great. I love Tolkien. I love his writing. The first book has been great so far, and I've read the books many times. But it's just a fun thing for me to do, to revisit certain books that I love, especially the ones that I read as a kid. But yeah, I love the Lord of the Rings books. I love the films. I haven't actually done the whole, extended edition marathons. I might have seen a couple extended editions, maybe not though. And so that's definitely something that I'll have to do eventually, watch all the 4-hour cuts of those films. But I love the theatrical cuts, at least, they're amazing films. It's not a coincidence that they were all nominated, I think, for Best Picture, if I'm not mistaken, or at least we know that the last one was, and the last one won Best Picture at the Oscars because it's just phenomenal. There's no wrong answer when someone asks you, what's your favorite Lord of the Rings film? Definitely no wrong answer. And I actually even enjoyed the Hobbit films. I love the book. And I thought, well, obviously, I have a couple videos, I think, on the YouTube channel about that Hobbit series, especially one where I talk about how I could have fixed it, facetiously kind of, but just talking about how it should have been shorter and whatnot. But at any rate, I thought that those three films at least had some of the spirit of Middle-earth that I enjoyed a lot. And so, even if they weren't the perfect films, and even if they weren't anything close to Lord of the Rings, I still enjoyed them quite a lot. And so coming into season 1 of The Rings of Power, I was a little skeptical. I was, how are they going to recapture any of the magic that was the Lord of the Rings? But I was also excited because it's new Lord of the Rings content. And the trailers looked promising. I knew that Amazon had spent a ton of money on this show. And so it was, definitely something that I was interested in. Obviously, I had heard about things like young Galadriel, young Elrond, and I think that was intriguing as well, to see where the show was going to go. That being said, the first season of Rings of Power, and I've only seen it once through, but was profoundly boring to me. And I'm not even going to say disappointing, because I think at a certain point early on in the season, I kind of understood what was going on and what my expectations should be throughout the remaining episodes. And so I don't even think by the time I finished The Rings of Power that I was disappointed, because I think very quickly I just kind of realized this is what these episodes are going to be like. They're not super enjoyable to watch. They're vaguely interesting. They have vaguely interesting bits of lore. But not that interesting to watch. I don't think I ever got attached to any particular subplot, any particular character. I think there were way too many subplots and way too many characters, which I know that it seems like an interesting criticism to make, given how the Lord of the Rings films are so expansive and so vast. And to be fair, I mean, I'm not the big Lord of the Rings aficionado. I don't know every single person's name. It takes me, rewatching each of the films to kind of be like, oh, that's Theoden, and that's that's Faramir, that all those kinds of things. And so I not having that kind of affinity to those characters, I get that. That's not, necessarily a bad thing. But I think what the Lord of the Rings films did really well is they centralized all these plots with characters you actually cared about. So you had Aragorn going off and recruiting all the ghosts right at the end of Return of the King, and then you had, I think it was Merry and Pippin, with the king as they marched, and you had Merry and Pippin with at the Battle of Helm's Deep, I think, or now I'm getting things mixed up, but you know what I mean, right? Like at the Battle of Helm's Deep, you had Legolas and Gimli, right? So you have characters that are attached to these subplots where, yeah, like not everything, you're not going to remember every single detail unless you're just that big of a Lord of the Rings fan, which kudos to you, I wish I could be. But you had characters that you really cared about, on top of obviously the central plot of Frodo and Sam, and then Gollum later on, carrying the ring to Mordor. So I just thought that the first season didn't really have any characters that I could attach to, and subsequently I didn't think that any of the storylines were that interesting that I could attach to. So when season 2 was announced, and I don't even think I realized they were making season 2, I mean, you knew that they were going to do it because you had spent that much money, and unless the seasons just flopped that hard, you were going to make a season 2 to try to push your luck even further, try to improve upon season 1. And so when I heard season 2 was coming imminently, I was pretty lukewarm, honestly. I thought, I'll watch it, obviously. I watch most, if not all, sci-fi, fantasy, big blockbuster kind of content. But I just wasn't excited about it. There was nothing there that made me go, oh, this is what I'm really excited about season 2. Then I saw the trailers, and people were ecstatic about the trailers. And I went, yeah, no, these are good trailers. But I also remember thinking, well, the trailers for the first season were also pretty good. And so I thought, yeah, I mean, there's nothing in these trailers to deter me from season 2, but there's nothing in these trailers that inherently gets me so pumped and so excited about season 2 that I go, yeah, I just cannot wait to watch Rings of Power season 2. So they dropped all 3 episodes at once. And I went through each episode. I watched each episode, not in one sitting. I watched, I think, episodes 1 and most of 2 in one day, and then the rest of it the next day. And let's go through it, and then I'll give my overall thoughts as we go along. So episode 1, again, full spoilers if you have not seen Rings of Power. I just talked a lot about non-spoilery things for Rings of Power season 2. So this is your final warning, spoiler alert for season 2 of Rings of Power. Let's finally dive into it. Okay, so in episode 1, one of the things that I loved, and I'm not gonna bury the lead here. I loved episode 1. I at first was a little bit lukewarm on the episode until I realized what was happening, and I'll kind of explain what that was in just a second. But what I loved about episode 1 is that you are getting the full brunt of the A storyline. And the A storyline is Sauron, Sauron, Sauron. It's everything to do with Sauron and his rise to power. I think it just said Sauron like 3 different ways in that one sentence. But Sauron, that's what I'm going to go with. You get the full brunt of the A storyline. And I love that because this is what's interesting. It's almost like, not to talk about a show that is, I mean, even more controversial somehow in The Acolyte. But, I talked about it last week. One of the things that I think we all kind of thought about The Acolyte was that, why wasn't the show about Darth Plagueis the whole time or the rise of the Sith, right? And that was really, a feeling I had about season 1 of The Rings of Power is like, okay, you reveal that Halbrand is Sauron at the end of season 1. Mordor comes into existence with the big, font change or whatever. Fine. Why wasn't this the season the whole time? Well, here in episode 1, you start out with Sauron immediately. And I'm going to be honest, guys, I didn't catch this at all. I thought the beginning of this show was just the beginning of, like the continuation from season 1. I thought, oh yeah, so Halbrand somehow turned into this different version of Sauron. I think the trailers also tricked me a little bit because the trailers and all the art and the banners had Sauron with the longer hair, not looking like Halbrand, and I kind of thought maybe he just transformed in between in between seasons. They just wanted a different look for the character. I don't know. I wasn't really paying attention. So I just kind of thought, oh yeah, like he's confronting Adar, who I'm going to be honest, I completely had no idea what happened to Adar after, I forgot what happened to him after the end of season 1. And so just seeing him again, I was like, oh yeah, sure. So the show completely got me if that was their intention, because I thought this is just a continuation. Then they kill him. Obviously, he's not dead. And you have this really creepy scene with the kind of sludge, intestines, I don't even know, essence of Sauron, clawing its way back to the earth, and then it turns back into the Halbrand version. And I kind of thought, okay, so he's just going back into disguise or something like that. I don't know. He's on the run or something like that. And then you get these really interesting scenes here where he's traveling to the south, and I still didn't catch this. I don't even know how. They were heading towards the south, and I didn't even catch this, but he runs into these sailors, and I actually think there's a really interesting and kind of poignant bit of writing here where he's talking to that sailor, and that guy goes, he asks, how are you going to be good, or how can someone be good, and the guy goes, you just got to do it, and then you do it the next day, and it's hard, but you got to do it the next day and keep doing it until it's part of your nature. There are actually some really well-written scenes in this in the beginning of this show that I wanted to point out here. Not all the writing is good. There are some bits of writing that are a little bit cringeworthy as well. But that scene in particular was really good. It made me wonder, okay, is there a little bit of remorse with Sauron? What's going on here? Is he kind of turning to good? That was something that I was like, maybe we don't really do that. I don't need Sauron in particular to be that sympathetic villain. I want him to be the cunning, manipulative, kind of villain. Sure enough, that's him. Like, he immediately turns his back on the guy, takes the necklace thing, and then he is on his way. And then when he was on the broken ship, I finally got it, and he reaches out for Galadriel, and I went, oh, this is the beginning of season 1. And that was, I don't know, that was really, really smart to me. Maybe you guys got it in the first 5 seconds of the show, and you're like, that was boring, it was dumb, it was stupid. I'm just telling you what my experience was. I actually thought, really, really, really good beginning. I love how they're setting you up for how Sauron, became Halbrand, right? Little interesting, his powers, that he's able to just kind of be goop and then turn into another person. It's kind of interesting. But then how, he got to interact with Galadriel, and then how Galadriel, obviously the entirety of season 1 is her kind of wavering and trusting Halbrand, and then you get you get what happens later with Halbrand betraying her, which I think I just really, really loved that opening. This series also still looks gorgeous. The cinematography, you can tell, CGI, everything, just, it looks great. It feels like they spent the dollars wisely. Whether or not they did, we'll have to see what the budgets are. but at least from what it looks like, it looks like you could totally watch this in a theater and be totally, like, yeah, this is meant for a theater. But yeah, I mean, what's different about episode 1 to me is just that it feels like the show has purpose because it's all about Sauron, right? So, you have Halbrand returning now, picking up after the end of season 1, returning to Mordor and talking with Adar and kind of negotiating his way out of it and going to Celebrimbor, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's so refreshing to see, and you get all this conflict now with Galadriel and Elrond because the rings are corrupting, right? The rings are corrupting the different elves, and Elrond is very steadfast. He says, no, we shouldn't be doing this. And I really think that that's working particularly well. I also love how at the end of this episode, they wear the rings and the trees are coming back, but you can kind of tell this is not the way it's supposed to be, right? Just how like the one ring makes you invisible. And that seems cool and all, especially to Bilbo at the beginning of A Fellowship of the Ring. But it's not. That's sort of part of the corrupting nature of the One Ring, and I think that this is a theme that's going to be playing out. Is that in these other rings? Because I don't think the One Ring is going to appear until maybe season 3 or 4, if they happen. But I think that this season in particular is going to be, I think, very clearly about the other rings, right? The Elven rings, the Dwarvish rings, and the rings for men. And I think it's so interesting that it's not just clear cut. It's not like, oh, you wear the ring and you become evil. It's like, no, the rings are doing good things for you, but that's what temptation is, right? The temptation for greed and for power get you good things sometimes, but they almost inevitably lead to your downfall, which I think is so interesting. So yeah, episode 1, really loved it. Now, I did not mention, because this is also part of episode 1, that there is a little bit of an interlude to the I'm going to call it Gandalf storyline because I think it's so obviously Gandalf, but if it's not Gandalf, then I'll be surprised. But yeah, the Gandalf storyline with the Harfoots, the Hobbit people, are they Hobbit adjacent? I don't even know what Harfoots are, but the Gandalf storyline, which I still maintain is just not that interesting. I think that I don't know, maybe the Gandalf storyline will end up coalescing around something. Like, eventually, I'm sure what they want is Gandalf to be a part of that final battle with Isildur, where, with the One Ring. Like, the little prologue flashback that they have at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, the movie. I'm sure that they want Gandalf there and, some origin story about Gandalf the Grey or whatnot. But I'm not that invested in this. I mean, they're just walking around for the most part, and Gandalf sees visions, but it's a bit of a slow burn, and I just frankly have no idea where it's going. There is a scene with a wizard, I think, in episode 2. We'll get there, I guess, in a second. But, maybe that's what it's hinting towards, but not entirely sure. But yeah, I mean, after episode 1, I was like, this is off to a great start, Can't wait to see what happens in episode 2. So we get to episode 2, and I'll say that episode 2 is probably my least favorite out of the 3, because I think that a lot of the momentum that we had in episode 1 is almost immediately halted here. And look, I mean, from a dialogue perspective, from a performance perspective, I enjoyed Durin a lot in season 1. I think that him and Elrond had a really good chemistry. I'm really sad that they're not together that much in this season so far. But I'm just not that invested in Durin, his wife, and Durin's dad. I'm just not. I mean, fine and all. And to be fair, right, the Durin plot becomes more interesting and important in episode 3. So at the very least, it's not like they're just throwing it away for no reason. There's a particular reason that you're including this subplot here, because the dwarves are very important. Obviously, the ring's made for the dwarves, right? So it's not entirely useless. But I'm not gonna lie and say that at the beginning, I get it, like all the earthquakes and stuff are shaking the mountain and whatever. But I'm just not that interested in the Durin subplot, just to be frank. I think that it's interesting, to now look at and then see the post the elves putting on the rings, how Sauron's spirit is almost embedded in these rings, right? And there's an interesting dilemma that's brought up at the end of this episode here, where you get the idea, right? Because on the one hand, there's this big debate. This is, I think, the best part of this episode, to be frank. You have Elrond and Galadriel fighting, right, over over whether or not to use the rings. And the dilemma here is so interesting in that, you can see one perspective where it's like, no, these rings were made of our own accord, which they're not, by the way. They're clearly being manipulated, by Sauron. But the one perspective is these rings were made to destroy Sauron, right? That's why we need them. And then the other perspective is that no, Sauron intentionally gave us these rings to destroy us. And that's why. I think it is more of the latter, obviously. But I also think that a little bit of the former has some truth in it as well. And that I think that, it's the very classic temptation of we could use the biggest weapon against our enemy, kind of thing. And I don't think that's untrue. I just think that the elves and the dwarves and the men will ultimately fall victim to it until their triumphant moment when they defeat Sauron at Mount Doom. Before Fellowship of the Ring and that prologue and whatever. But I think it's just such an interesting argument that they're making here is, these rings have this seductiveness, this temptation that actually makes a lot of sense. And, you totally buy why Elrond is standing one way and saying, no, we can't be using this. And then why, what's his name? Kindar? Círdan? I don't remember his name. But the guy that, Elrond entrusts the ring to in episode 1, and he goes and tries to destroy it, and he just can't. And then they hold on to it, which I think is just so interesting. So yeah, I mean, again, the part about Durin and Disa, I think, his wife, I just don't find to be that interesting, but the stuff about Elrond and Galadriel, really interesting. Speaking of less interesting, obviously we went to the Harfoot and Gandalf subplot, but then it seems like Nori and Poppy are dead, which I think is kind of interesting. That's one way to write out characters of a story, which is kind of cruel and kind of mean. You could have just written them out to begin with, but I don't know, maybe they're not dead. They're probably not dead. Just sort of an interesting thing, because they also keep doing this. Like in episode 3, Theo is kind of written out in the same way, but he's clearly alive, so who knows what's happening on this level. But yeah, we also get, again, even, speaking of the better scenes in this episode, we get scenes with Sauron again. He's with Celebrimbor, and am I mispronouncing that? Celebrimbor? I don't know, maybe. You'll have to let me know in the comments down below. But he's with the smith, and he turns into this different form. He's so manipulative. He's like, I am the Lord of Gifts, and I'm here to save you. And I just think that's so cool, right? This is what the series should have been about the entire time, is Sauron manipulating these different groups of people, the elves, the men, and the dwarves, to fight amongst themselves while he is seeking to forge the One Ring and rule all of Middle-earth. I think that is just so awesome. So we head into episode 3. That's sort of the state of play. And episode 3, I think, is okay. I think episode 2 is kind of teetering on not that interesting to okay. I think episode 3 is in the very solid camp. Episode 1 I loved, by the way. I still think episode 1 is easily the best episode out of any of the episodes that I watched of Rings of Power. But episode 3, I think, is heading in the right direction, but it's still just okay. And really, that boils down to the fact that there's just not enough Sauron in this episode. And I think that is such a funny thing to say, because obviously Sauron is the big bad. But that storyline is just endlessly fascinating to me. And yeah, I wanted more Sauron, more Mordor. What's interesting about the show, though, is that while each episode is not individually switching between all the different characters, it seems like they're reintroducing characters in a staggered way, which I think is fine. I just wonder if they're going to have to rush, for example, Isildur's storyline in 4 episodes instead of 8 episodes, or however long the season is, because they introduced him in episode 3, or because we didn't really get, Gandalf that much. They're going to rush his storyline in episode 6 or whatever. I kind of hope that's not the case here. Critics have seen the whole show, and some of them do seem to like the show a lot this season, and so we'll have to see about that. But yeah, this episode is about Isildur, who I don't know, I've been spoiling a lot of Lord of the Rings already, but if you haven't seen Lord of the Rings, kind of an important character at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. So, and again, not to spoil the first 3 minutes of the Fellowship of the Ring, but yeah, going to be a kind of important character moving on. So I think it's interesting that we're going to have to build this character up, because I don't particularly find him that interesting, honestly, at this point. He has speaking of those really well-written conversations, he has one of those with the other woman who I'm struggling to remember her name. A lot of new characters also, just in addition to like the mountains and mountains of pre-existing characters. But he has the conversation about I think about grieving, right? Or not just grieving, but it was about guilt and I think grace, which I think is super interesting, right? Because it's about how Isildur is talking about his mother and saying she died and she died to save me, and I've been living my life ever since to repay that, and I just can't. And it's just this conversation about how to live with guilt in light of the grace of someone else's sacrifice is just so interesting and profound to me. With big even religious undertones. J.R.R. Tolkien was a Christian, and you definitely see a lot of parallels there. But anyways, I think that I think there are those pockets of really well-written dialogue that make me hope that there's something really big there for this show to kind of to deal with and to grasp. But aside from that, Theo's back. Theo, not my favorite character, actually probably one of my least favorite characters in season 1. Feel bad that his, the mother died. But yeah, the whole Arondir and Theo storyline, I don't know, not that interesting. He kind of fake dies in this episode, but not really. I'm sure he's alive. And then the other big part of this episode was about the Queen Regent, which I thought was pretty boring up until the very end, which I thought, okay, we're getting to the coronation. She's going to get coronated and there's going to be some unrest, but it happens and then we move on. What I wasn't expecting, though, was actually the whole uprising to happen. That's definitely not what I was expecting, because then all the people kind of rise up. The eagle shows up out of nowhere, which I think is kind of funny, and then we get kind of a coup in the middle of that ceremony, which I think, again, really, really fascinating. And going back to the actual storyline that I think is the most interesting, we of course get our Sauron moments where he's talking with Celebrimbor and he is forging the rings for the dwarves. And I just think, again, give us more of that stuff. The episode ends, I think, on that note, and I need more of that Sauron plot. If you just keep going back and forth, like if all of next episode is about Gandalf with 5 minutes of Sauron, I'm going to be a little bit unhappy, because that is really what's working for this show so far. So in summation, because we've been talking a lot about each of the individual episodes, but I just, to close out this episode of the Access Blockbusters Pod, wanted to just give my quick thoughts on the series, or not the series as a whole, but the 3 episodes as a whole. I think that they're good. They show promise. Now, it's interesting because it's not like these 3 episodes, in my opinion, are very even. I think that, like I said, I loved episode 1. I thought episode 2 was not the greatest, but it was okay. And then I think episode 3 was fine, if not, decently solid. And it's not the best outcome if you're hoping for season 2 to be a massive upgrade from season 1, but there is promise with this show. This show feels like it has more direction now in season 2 than it had in season 1. And I think that with all of that said, we can expect a lot of really interesting things to come, as long as they keep focusing on the Sauron plot. And look, if all these other storylines eventually, and by eventually I mean hopefully soon, coalesce around that Sauron plot, the Gandalf storyline, because like I mentioned, I should have talked about this a little bit more in episode 2, but we did get another wizard that showed up. Is that Saruman? I don't know, maybe, could be another random wizard, but anyways, as long as all these subplots begin to coalesce around the Sauron subplot, because eventually what we're building towards, right, is just the all-out war, which might be season 3 or season 4, whatever they're planning on. But just, as long as we're getting towards that that main storyline, I think it'll be a good thing moving forward. So yeah, let me know if you've seen all 3 episodes of The Rings of Power. I've just spoiled them all in great detail. So if you have not, apologies, but let me know if you have. Let me know what you think about the show so far in the comments down below. And with that, guys, that'll do it for this episode 38 of the Access Blockbusters Pod. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. It has been a joy, again, to join you and to just talk about some of these really fun things. Next week, we'll probably be doing a preview of the Penguin, and maybe even Agatha, or maybe we'll do a preview of Agatha the next week. But a lot of fun stuff coming up. And I should have mentioned during the Rings of Power actual segment that it's going to be fun because we'll have things to talk about for many weeks to come. I think there will be a couple weeks in late September where mid to late September where we'll have episodes of Agatha, Penguin, and Rings of Power going at the same time, which I think is really exciting. I miss those days where you had just so much to talk about, in addition to all the other fun stuff that's been going on with movies and television shows. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a very exciting time here on the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel. Again, if you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters channel, make sure to do so. Give this video a like. Let me know what you think about the podcast in the comments down below. Or if you're watching on Spotify, make sure to leave a rating. If you're listening on Spotify, I should say. And that'll do it for me for this episode, guys. And I will see you guys in the next one.